On today's episode of the Black Studies Podcast, we have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Therí Pickens, Charles A. Dana Professor of English and Africana at Bates College. Dr. Pickens creates powerful, groundbreaking, award-winning scholarship in the fields of Arab American Studies, Black Studies, Comparative Literature, and Disability Studies. She wrote Black Madness, Mad Blackness, a theoretical tour de force which fundamentally shapes Black disability studies. Her editorial work ushered in new conversations about Black disability studies in two major journals, African American Review and College Language Association Journal. Her first monograph, New Body Politics, Narrating Black and Arab Identity in the United States, brought together Arab and Black American literary and cultural production through the lens of Black feminism and disability studies. In another editorial project, Arab American Aesthetics, she curates a discussion about what makes artistic production uniquely Arab American. Professor Pickens' public writing refuses to diminish or premasticate the complexities of our world for a wider public. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, The Washington Post, Black Girl Nerds, The Counter, Inside Higher Ed, and Miss Magazine. She is a sought-after podcast guest who brings wit, excitement, and humor to podcasts, including Busy Being Black, Contemporary Black Canvas, New Books Network, The Cipher, and the MoMA podcast. Alongside her scholarship, Dr. Pickens is a poet whose first collection, What Had Happened Was, debuted in 2025 from Duke University Press. She is a proud alum of Margaret Porter Troop Arts, Community of Writers, Kenyon Writers Retreat, Colgate Writers Workshop, Bread Loaf Sicily, Hurston Wright, Vona, and Rutgers University Poets and Scholars Retreat. Her poetry has been published and is forthcoming from Prairie Schooner, The Journal, Diode, Black Renaissance Noir, Omnium, Gatherum Quarterly, Langston Hughes Review, The Madison Review, and Kane, a new critical edition. In addition to Dr. Pickens' research, she coaches with the National Council for Faculty Development and Diversity, and she also runs her own developmental editing and sensitivity reading business, Inquiry Editing LLC. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Black Studies Podcast. Today, we have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Therí Pickens, Charles A. Dana Professor of English and Africana at Bates College. How are you doing today, Dr. Pickens?
I'm doing well. It's great to be here.
So great to have you. I'm very excited to talk to you today. So I know that there's a range of things that we can cover because your research hits many different categories. But I'll start with how you got into Black Studies and what keeps you committed to doing work with Black Studies.
Sure. So, like a lot of children of boomers or Gen Xers who were the first generation in their family to go to college, Black Studies was just part of how I grew up, right? So, memorizing poems, learning different historical facts, all of that was just, kind of part of the ethos of my home. And so when my parents divorced and I was moved from a Black school system in East Orange, New Jersey, to a predominantly white school system in Maplewood, New Jersey, one of the things that became very clear to me was that I was definitively a Black person who loved Black people and was not cowed by some of those other students, and not particularly impressed with their version of excellence. And so I think carrying that with me through to college, meant that I was of course going to take African American Studies class. It was one of the first classes I took in the fall of my first year. So I've been with Black Studies. I think deciding to study Blackness broadly, I think in graduate school was a choice. And I don't mean that in like a shady way. I mean that in the sense that I was getting a PhD in comparative literature and my two languages were Spanish and Arabic. And Black Studies was informing everything I did, but I ended up needing to switch to a project that was inside the United States for a couple of different reasons. Some of them related to illness, some of them related to just the time of doing a Spanish and Arabic project. Um, but yeah, I mean, I've been with it, I've stuck with it, I've questioned it a lot, but it does feel like a space I consistently come back to, along with Arab American studies, of course.
Thank you. So you do work in Arab American studies, Black disability studies. You also have your creative work that you do.
Mhm.
Um, and of course, comparative literature, because that's amazing.
My training, yeah.
How do you situate yourself in relationship to the different fields and disciplines that your work intersects with?
Sure. So because I had to put something on the website, I came up with this ABCs sort of way of thinking about it: Arab American studies, Black studies, comparative literature, disability studies. And they are all, much like the alphabet, working together all at the same time. Um, and, they combine in different ways. So, comparative ethnic studies with Arab folks and Black folks together, this thinking about what it is to compare folks, right, in terms of literature. It's always an odd thing because you never want to suggest a narrative of continuous cross-racial dysfunction, and you never want to suggest that either one is wholly separate from the other, because there are always people who belong to both groups simultaneously. And also, I think with disability studies, that is one of the anchors of my work. I consistently return to the body, I consistently return to the mind, and consistently return to access as a principle. So they're all there. I kind of, they can be overlapping concentric circles. They can be a Venn diagram. There's all sorts of ways of visualizing it. I think with every project I do, they're all present in some way. So I I don't really choose. I just sort of decide on what it is I'm interested in and chase that thing. And then everything else kind of comes up alongside it. Um, and then as far as the poetry, that is definitively influenced by everything I do and see. Um, so I'm one of those writers that's slightly dangerous to be in my orbit because something you say to me sparks a poem or, some essay. I do ask permission, but it is the purview of poets to observe. And when my eye is trained toward the scholarship, I'm still observing that scholarship and how it works and what people are doing, what people are saying. I'm still thinking of creatives, not just writers, but visual artists and all sorts of folks as at the vanguard, where critics are always a step behind because critics have to wait till the work is produced. So, I get to be an artist now, and that that feels like a different space to be in, but it is all part and parcel of the same intellectual, I guess, impetus.
Thank you. I know. So I want to ask about a couple things. One, I know that there is an influence of like Afrofuturism on the work that you do with
Mhm.
regards to Black disability studies. And then I also just want to ask about your creative work, like your recent book of poetry, and how you see that as coming back and as you said, like you're observing at all times, and being a creative allows you to be kind of on the forefront, whereas that's not necessarily the case with like academic research
Yeah,
or critiquing. Um, so a little bit about how that is helpful in how you think about the other things that you want to do outside of the strictly creative area.
sure. So, Afrofuturism is one of the spaces I turn to in the second book because Octavia Butler, Tananarive Due, Nalo Hopkinson, and Matt Johnson were creating these worlds. And that seemed like one of the spaces in terms of the literature where creatives were simply ahead of critics. Um, Critics were chronicling, creatives were creating. And so I turned to that as a way to push how we could think about Blackness and disability together. The first book doesn't deal with Afrofuturism at all. It actually deals with realist fiction and Magic Johnson as a way to kind of consider where we are in
Mhm.
terms of how we think about the body as a space for social and political critique. And I think part of the reason why that needed to be realist fiction is because it was a cartography, just a laying of the land. Um, that being said, Afrofuturism, Black speculative fiction, folks are simply trying to imagine a world where they're not degraded. And being able to do that, you kind of need, some different rules about the world. And so that's one of the reasons why I think many of us in the field keep turning to it. I think about Sammy Schalk's work, Cassandra Jones's work. We keep turning to Afrofuturism and speculative fiction because those folks are imagining something new. Um, I think the poetry is a way for me to imagine something new. So, one, with scholarship and criticism, your job is to distill, your job is to clarify, and your job is to make things that are slightly messy understandable to folks. You don't want to distill them so far that they become too simplistic to account for the real world, but you also don't want to refuse to distill them so that people are still confused, right?
Mhm.
And so because that's your job as a critic or as a scholar to clarify the thing, when you are creative, you get to be, or at least this is how I think of it, you get to be a little messy. You get to say in maybe 14 lines something that is broad and ineffable and um, considered, but still, doesn't attempt to create clarity. So it has a clarity of a certain kind, maybe a clarity of feeling, maybe a clarity of inciting incident, but not necessarily the clarity of this thing means this thing means that. And
Mhm.
so that's one of the reasons why I'm drawn to the creative work. I think if you ask my relatives, they will say, well, she's always been a writer, she's always been a poet, she's always been a little, I don't know if they would say off. They might be kinder to me. They might say creative, or they might say, she thinks a lot. Um, but, I've been writing creatively since I was about 5 years old. And so I am in the academy as a writer because I love to write, but also because it's one of the few ways that you as a writer can get health insurance. And so that is partially why I am here. Like, this is my vocation, right? For some people, it's just a job, and I respect those folks. But for me, this is a vocation, and it is also um, the solution to a particular kind of problem with being an artist in the United States, being a writer in the United States. So that's how those all kind of come together. I don't think I answered all of the questions, but that feels like partially.
I appreciate that. That definitely, it answered the question that I.
Okay.
So, how is your work as a teacher informed by Black studies or even Black disability studies
Sure.
or Arab American studies, right? Like, so how do you take the work that you do, your scholarship and your creative work, and integrate that into the classroom?
Yeah. So at a broad base level, just the people I teach, the stuff I teach come from those spaces. Um, Whenever I teach a course that isn't explicitly Black studies or Arab American studies, so I'm housed in an English department, and I teach methods on occasion. So I make sure that we have Arab and Black folks on the syllabus. I make sure that we deal primarily with writers of color, because you can always get from a historically marginalized group to the center, but you can't get from the center to the periphery as well. So if I decided I wanted to teach, and no shade to any of these books, if I decided I wanted to teach Catcher in the Rye, you can't get from Holden Caulfield to Bigger Thomas. You have to go the other way around.
Mhm.
Um, And yeah, I mean, so that's one way. The other way is in the structures. So I don't believe that I'm in a position of pastoral care with my students. I'm not required to um, kind of hear their personal grievances the way that the institution sort of markets Black professors as like the aunts and uncles and cousins and brothers and sisters of the students. That's not my role. And in fact, I think I would do much more damage in that role than I would be useful because I'm not trained to do some of that work. I'm not trained to do any of that work, but I don't want to harm my students. So I try to take care in my class to set up the intellectual environment so that they can approach the work we do in the classroom, that labor, they can approach it knowing that someone has gone before them and created a syllabus that makes sense, that doesn't overload them, but also does challenge them. If I can't take for granted, for instance, in my 200 level classes, that students are all showing up with the same information, then, we have a 3-week kind of boot camp
Mhm.
where we just create a common vocabulary through looking at literary criticism and literary history and um, some um, some theory as a way to get them kind of ready for what we're doing. And the other things are in the policies and procedures. So I make it pretty explicit that disabled students are welcomed and valued in the classroom. I make it pretty explicit that I believe in self-advocacy for all students. And I ask students to be responsible for their time and my time, which I think is one of the ways of insisting that what we do is crucial and insisting that the work itself requires some degree of respect. So those are some of the ways that those come in, and those come in from, Black Studies was never it was never a fait accompli that Black Studies would be in the academy because Black Studies was always happening outside,
Mhm.
right? So you've got The Crisis, you've got The Colored American, you've got Fire, you've got people publishing like Ralph Ellison publishing essays, James Baldwin writing. This was prior to anything we could call Black Studies.
Yeah.
And so it's always existed outside the academy. Audre Lorde always existed outside the academy, Pat Parker, et cetera. So all of that was about access, that the people deserved access to information. And Arab American communities understand their intellectual spaces as communal as well. And so one of the reasons why I'm always interested in students being part of a community, valuing community, is because that's the space out of which my scholarship and the um, the subjects that I look at come from.
Thank you.
Mm.
I wanna follow up and ask a little bit more about, um, teaching methods.
Sure,
Something that has come up quite a bit, in different conversations we've had for the podcast. The ways in which being oriented in particular ways with regards to Black studies, or women and gender studies comes up, quite a bit, how that influences how you approach methods and how you talk about methods to students.
sure. So I also teach the Intro to Africana course when I'm needed to do that too. So I'm going to include that in my answer. When we think about methods in an academic sense, mm, it is a way of describing how we approach the material,
Mhm.
what we approach as material, like what is appropriate to look at in the academic discipline or the field that we're in, and what's the history of those approaches. So you can get at this in English all kinds of ways. One of the ways that I have found quite useful is to teach students where an English department comes from. It isn't necessarily the case that there has always been English departments, right? and that they're called English departments everywhere. So you have some literature departments, you have MLT at Stanford, um, you've got comparative literature and English side by side, you've got rhetoric that cover, rhet comp.
Mhm.
So trying to teach students where this comes from is a way of ripping down the curtain. Like, here's all the rest of the stuff that comes into, why your course requirements are what they are, how it is that we come to understand periodicity in English as the way of thinking about how we divvy up requirements, right? So, but that's one way. I think for me, the question of what we approach in English, if you are traditional, you are thinking of English as only the written stuff in
Mhm.
English, usually by native speakers or translated. And that strikes me as, particularly as someone trained in comparative literature, short-sighted. So, one of the things that I think is crucial is to introduce students to, um, like in my Black Lives Matter class, we look at staged plays. So we look at the Wizard of Oz, the NBC version with David Allen Greer and I think Neo. We also look at Todrick Hall's
Mhm.
Straight Outta Oz, which, you know, couldn't possibly be called literature other than, like, it existed in written form at some point, but it draws on this long history and tradition of The Wizard of Oz and Wicked and The Wiz and all of those together, and does so around the time of, 2014, Trayvon Martin, protests,
Mhm.
um, which is a pretty awkward way of describing them, but I'll go with that for now. Um, so I try and get a larger sense of what it is we study, like what it is we can approach as English scholars. And then I think the how is the space where Black studies and Arab American studies intervenes. Because the how is not just a sense of, okay, well, what's the genre? Is it poetry? Is it short fiction? What's the, using genre in another way, is it Afrofuturism? Is it realist? Is it mystery? Is it romance? Um, what, gosh, what's the plot? What's the theme? What's the motif, etc. You can get at all of that. And largely speaking, by the time you reach a methods course in English, you have some sense of what that is.
Mhm.
But how do you read for class? How do you read for race? How do you read for gender? What are the theories that you need to employ in order to read those appropriately and correctly? So, one of the things that I teach students about queer studies is that you're not just looking for who one wants to be with or who one desires. You're not just looking at desire, although you are also looking at desire. You are looking at all of the ways that heteronormativity determines the um, the structure of a character's life or their trajectory. So, for instance, heteronormativity determining a career, right, in a Bildungsroman novel, in a novel about someone coming of age. If the expectation is that someone will leave high school, go to college, get married, have a child, and then quit their career for a couple of years and then come back if it's a female identified
Mhm.
character, that is a particularly heteronormative trajectory. It is queer to decide I'm not going to college because I don't have access to gender affirming care, or this college that I really want to go to has adopted Trump's understanding of gender, right? It's a decision that is understood as queer to refuse to have children, right? What does your career look like if you um, have top surgery and you transition in the middle of your career and you move states,
Mhm.
right? So there's a whole bunch of different ways that I'm trying to get students to understand how we read for the identities that we're in community with, or that people who we live among. Because let's face it, not every English major is going to be a writer. Not every English major is going to spend their career or even their recreational life reading, but they will vote. They will, run for school board, right? And they will, coach little league, right? Like, if they can't read an environment, fictive or real, for class, race, gender, disability, etc., then what use is their degree? That's how I approach methods. Um, what we look at, how we look at it. Um, yeah, yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
I think that that's a helpful framing, right? To think about what we're looking at and how we're looking at it, and understanding that there is a need to be able to read beyond maybe the more commonly
There
taught
are
things or the more established methods, which is the same word. But there is a need to be able to move beyond that and to read for things like race and class and gender and disability. I think that that's a really important reminder.
I think one of the things about teaching is that you do have to steward a class. You're responsible for getting them from point A to point B intellectually. And
Mhm.
so just wanting, it's one thing when it's a physics class and you are in, physics 2 when you have to move them from this concept to that concept. And that gives you a very clear trajectory, but there also still has to be a way that you introduce them to the wherefores of all of that. So I think about what it is to change your examples, right, for
Mhm.
chemistry. Um, if you're looking at corrosive acids, do you talk about perms? If you're looking at the oscillation between base pH and acidic pH, are you talking about the use of baking soda and apple cider vinegar that some natural hair care folks do?
Mhm.
You look at the lawsuit, like the chemical information from the lawsuit for people who were adventitiously blinded by cleaning products, right? There's the science itself doesn't change, right? The methods in English don't necessarily change. We're still looking at metaphor, we're still looking at image, we're still looking at turns of phrase. Um, but the examples and where the examples come from does change the the purview of the learner. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
That yeah, that makes perfect sense. Okay, so I wanted to ask you about what interests you most about the past of Black studies in both critical and excited senses.
Oh, hmm. Okay. I don't know why I'm acting like I haven't seen these questions before because you did send them, but having to answer them, that's why it's so different. Okay. So, one of the things that I'm currently excited about regarding the past of Black studies, is the editorial work. So as someone who like I run a developmental editing business and I've
Mhm,
edited 2 special issues and edited a volume on Arab American aesthetics, I think of myself as operating in a tradition of like Jesse Redmond Fawcett and Toni Morrison, um, and bringing voices together. And so one of the things that I'm excited to just take a look at, um, is how editorial work functions. Um, I'm really I'm really in awe of what it takes to gather voices without the particular technologies that we rely on.
mhm,
How did people do this with, self-addressed stamped envelopes? How do people do this without email? Um, without cell phones, right? Um, and I get curious about that. Um, in part because that editorial work and that care of helping a writer to sound more like themselves feels like both an honor and a responsibility. And so
mhm.
that's one of the things that I'm currently excited about. I do find myself teaching more work that has been edited explicitly. So I'm teaching Words of Fire, edited by Beverly Guy Sheftall this fall. And yeah, that's one of the things I'm excited about regarding the past. Um, yeah.
Is there anything about the past of Black studies that you're more critical of?
Sure. I think, Erica Edwards has talked about this, but I see it in the ways that we're thinking about what to do in this current moment. And it's the reliance on this sort of great man messianic
Mhm.
narrative about Black history writ large and about Black artistry. That there can only be one, and I think I'll use Jean Jarrett's words for this, one dean of a particular school, and then everybody else that doesn't fall under that is sort of a truant. I think about the categories that we put people in, and I think musically we do this all the time. You couldn't love India Ari and Alicia Keys at the same time. You couldn't love Brandy and Monica at the same, like, you had to choose. Like, you couldn't love TLC and In Vogue. That wasn't like a formal thing. Like, people weren't sort of pitting them against each other, but you were either into that grown woman music and it was In Vogue, or you were like a poppy 20 something into TLC, and you had to choose. Um, I never did. I always went based on the vibe. Like, Alicia Keys is a whole different vibe from NDRE, etc. But the categories, the categories that we place people in, and the way that we narrate Black studies, the way that we narrate Black history, um, tends to be, or tends to have been, um, I think pretty narrow and very much conforming to a kind of heteronormative masculinist version of history.
Yeah. I think that, like, as you point out, I think Afrofuturism and especially Black speculative fiction is really helpful for envisioning new ways to think about not just the future, but how we are looking at the past,
Yeah, absolutely.
um, and what that means for what is possible moving forward.
Yeah. I mean, I don't, for folks who've seen Wakanda, as soon as they figured out that there was another place that was using vibranium, was it like the military commander is like, what about the fables? What about the stories? And like, as soon as something changes in the present, you automatically have to rethink the past.
Mhm.
I was like, I have many favorite parts in that movie, but that's one of my favorites because it really speaks to me as a writer. That her first concern is, what about all the stuff we've been told? What about all of the things that we think we know about our world? And as soon as you start examining your future, your present differently, you have to think about the past differently as well.
That's such an important point, particularly right now.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Because on this dumpster fire hurtling through the atmosphere, I'm like, what past do we pull on now? Um, yeah.
Yeah. But challenging that heteronormative
Yeah.
masculinist interpretation of the past opens up so many more possibilities
Yeah.
and avenues for us to go. Like, if we're just gonna continue with that narrow focus or that narrow interpretation, yeah, it's a wrap. But if we expand and we're able to look at the things and to take seriously the things that people have been doing for decades and centuries that do
Mhm.
not fit within that particular interpretation of what is important and what is valid, then there's so much more that can happen
Yeah.
now
Because
despite the
those
dumpster
past
fire.
Yeah, exactly. Because those past interpretations don't even serve the people they're meant to serve.
Mm-mm.
So, what happens when you put so much pressure on King that you don't look at Bayard Rustin, or that you don't look at Coretta Scott King, or you don't understand what Mamie Till Mobley did? Like, what happens when when there's so much pressure on King that you cannot fathom that he possibly cheated on his wife, right? Like, what happens when you need a messiah to understand freedom struggles? It means you lose sight of the fact that the bus boycott was gonna go forward whether King was there or not.
Yeah.
You lose sight of, like, all of the grunt work it takes to do activism. It's not just, hopping up on top of cars and making speeches. It's not just being loud. It's, somebody's gotta do the signs, somebody's gotta pick the venues, somebody's gotta chart the path that folks are walking, somebody's gotta organize that crowd. Like, all of that stuff has to happen.
Mhm.
And so it doesn't serve us to look back with those with those lenses. Um, yeah, it doesn't serve us.
No. And like you said, all of that had to happen without technology that we have
Yes,
to.
yes. I remember
Flyers,
phone
whatever.
trees. Yeah, like, I remember phone trees. Like, what it was for it, like, somebody had an idea, and then you had to run it down the phone tree, and you were responsible for calling the next person. They were responsible, like,
Mhm.
it was a whole way of organizing that used that, that very ana ana analog technology of the house phone, right?
House,
Um,
yes.
the house phone with a cord,
Yes. Yes.
possibly rotary.
Yeah. I think I think it's changed now, but for the longest, the phone in my grandparents' basement was a rotary phone,
Yeah, same,
and the
same.
other
It's
ones I upgraded, but that one stayed a rotary phone for, I think, most of my life,
yeah, same.
and I don't even know if my daughter would know how to. I'm absolutely sure she would not use that, like,
I mean, it's not an intuitive technology,
mm-mm.
and the rapidity with which we are used to tapping on things makes it makes it feel incredibly slow. You have to find the hole, put your finger in it, and then circle back, and then wait, tick, 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 and then, God forbid you have to do a 9 or a 0.
Yes.
So, you're circling and waiting for it's a lot.
But it is also representative of the amount of work in a very small subset that went in to
Yes,
making these things happen that we, as you said, overlook or push aside, don't take seriously when we have to have a savior, usually a man, who is the one who made all of these things happen. Like, that's not how that worked.
right, right.
So, on that note, what interests excites you about the future of Black studies?
I mean, the easy answer is the fact that we're moving away from much of that, and so, like, looking at recent scholarship, Aisha K. Hardison, Miriam Thaggart, um, Erica Edwards, um, even including sort of trade scholarship, someone like Linda Villarosa and, Jarvis Givens. We are moving away from these sort of singular narratives of people, um, men or women, that make history, and so keep pushing on the collective idea. So it allows for collective world building and collective struggle, such that you can have a diffuse space like the movement for Black Lives where things are local, right?
Mhm,
Where the organizing for the school board and the organizing for midterm elections comes from the same wellspring of localized knowledge and national and international focus. So I think scholarship is shifting. I think activism is shifting. And I want to rely on something that Patricia Smith said at Furious Flower last year. And it is specifically that she always looks forward to the poets that come behind her. So Patricia Smith is an established poet, and if I think if she were a different kind of person, she wouldn't necessarily care who's coming up behind her, right? Because we certainly have poets who are like, I have done the things, and if I find some cool people, I find them, but if not, whoop de doo. But Furious Flower doesn't allow for that. But Patricia Smith also was very explicit when she got up to do her reading that she was excited for what I don't want to butcher this person's name, but Canisia Lubrin was doing. I was a person that read before her, and it was glorious. Um, and so I think as a poet, as a scholar, I'm excited for the folks who are coming behind me because they don't have to do the groundwork that I had to do for Black disability studies or for comparative ethnic studies. They don't necessarily have to repeat the same disability 101, Black disability 101 that I've had to do. And they can move forward with um, with creating more space for scholarship, with creating accessible space for scholarship. And for the creatives, I'm looking forward to seeing who else is maybe in conversation with me that I haven't read yet. Um,
Mhm.
because my first collection, I mean, I love it. I'm really proud of it. And also, yeah, like I'm not the only poet thinking about Black linguistics and storytelling and disability and how all of those things come together. I mean, yeah.
So, do you want to say a little bit more about your recent book?
Yes. So it's entitled What Had Happened Was. It came out in it was March 28th, 2025. That's my book's birthday. Um, a lovely Aries. And it is it's an exploration, I think, of how we tell stories about our lives and how we tell stories about who we want to be. So there's some historical focus in there. There's some shade in there. There's all sorts of things that, if you're familiar with them, you understand them kind of way. Like, um, I can always tell who actually speaks in the vernacular that I use based on how they state the title. If anyone stumbles over the had, um, I know that it's not a phrase they use. And so it's fascinating for it to function as a shibboleth in that way. Um, but for most of the poems, the disabled body is at the center. Disabled body, disabled mind is at the center. And I wanted to ask how we tell stories about who we are and who we want to be in history from the perspective of a body that is experiencing disability or chronic illness, because then that body gets to be erratic, that body gets to be at the center of history, that body gets to be um, the place from which we make meaning, the um, the epistemological anchor of Blackness. Which, to be honest, I think when you look at Black history, you usually see a wide variety of disabled bodies and minds making history at the center. Thinking about Fannie Lou Hamer, thinking about Emmett Till, thinking about Harriet Tubman, and all those folks who experienced or dealt with disability in some way um, at the center of history. So, yeah, that's what the book's about, basically.
Yeah, that I think that that's as you said, the if we look at Black history, there are many examples of people who were dealing with chronic illness or disabilities, making history. But I don't. That's not always foregrounded, or it's not always acknowledged or mentioned.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
I think Black history has a pretty fraught relationship with disability, and you can tell by the way my voice is going up that both uncomfortable and difficult to acknowledge. I mean, it's a historical issue, right? So that consistently disability and Blackness are understood as combined, right?
mhm,
Feeble mind with the brute body, or the body that's meant to be weakened in the postbellum period, or the mind that is not capable of political thought, etc. Right? So consistently, Black folks are having to navigate disability as a slur, and so we have other names for it that
Mhm.
correspond to the gifts that people have, or the experiences, or the challenges they navigate. I think a lot of people use that word as a way to make it clear that those challenges can be um, dealt with, dispensed with, or otherwise accommodated by a community. So I think the language around disability is quite different in Black studies spaces and in Black spaces writ large. Um, but I also think that it's a fraught relationship.
Well, we can end it there. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
Nah, I mean, I'm really grateful for spaces like this because I think it does the work of Black studies, sort of adjacent to the academy, but also outside of it. So I'm really glad to be a guest here. And I saw some of the other guests, and I was like, "Oh, this is nice." So yeah, I mean, I'm thrilled to be part of the number, and I'm excited for where we're all headed, in a positive sense. I always got hope. So yeah.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much.